In this video, it's all about frame rates. Frame rates build the base of movies because without frame rates it would just be pictures, and that would not be as pleasant as a moving picture. And the moving picture starts at around 24 frames per second, where the eye and the brain can no longer distinguish between one single frame and the movie. But the thing is, there are more frame rates than just 24. There's 30 frames, there's 60, there's 120, there's 48, there's 240 and even 1000 plus frames per second. But why would you want to use those, and what for? And which one should you use when? Because there are actually reasons to shoot in 24 frames per second, and then there are reasons to shoot in 60 or more frames per second. To kind of have a mind construct of what is happening inside the camera, with each frame the camera actually has to take a picture. So if we are shooting at 24 frames per second, the camera is actually taking 24 pictures per second. In most cases, those pictures are in less quality than the actual megapixels the cameras offer, but overall the camera has to do a lot of work. Kind of the normal reason to use 24 frames per second is because it looks cinematic. In Europe and Germany you might as well use 25 frames per second because that is better in sync with the electronic network, and some light sources actually have this kind of flickering if you're using 24 frames per second instead of 25 frames per second. But in general, 24 and 25 frames per second are the way to go if you want to shoot movie-style stuff without slow motion. Then once you start playing with slow motion, you want to go into the 60 or 120 frames per second area, which you can actually slow down in post-production. But there's the additional reason for 24 frames per second, and that is if you're, for example, shooting in low light situations. Because with 24 frames a second, you should have a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, which of course is much longer instead of using a shutter speed of 120th of a second if you're shooting with 60 frames per second. So in low light situations and for normal shooting, for non-slow motion video, and especially for the cinematic look, you would choose the 24 frames per second. I personally almost always shoot in 60 frames per second, because those 60 frames per second is what my camera, the Sony a7 Mark II, offers with full HD and the normal sensor size. So the full frame sensor size, 60 frames per second in full HD is the most I can get out of it. And looking at my videos, I use slow motion a lot to kind of make everything smoother and have it in a more dreamy kind of look. And that is the way I do almost everything. Now, if I'm shooting interview style stuff, or for example these videos, I shoot it with 24 or 25 frames per second because I don't really use the slow motion part. But in general, I use the 60 frames per second. The same is true for my GoPro shooting. I use the 60 frames per second in the 2.7K settings most of the time because that gives me the ability to slow the footage down and have a little bit more room in the full HD version if I scale down the 2.7K, so I can actually play around with kind of the digital zoom on the GoPro instead of using the 4K, which only shoots 24 frames per second. Or if I would shoot in the 120 frames per second in the full HD mode, then I would not be able to crop in later. So in general, on my main camera, I use the 60 frames per second in full HD, and on the GoPro, I use the 60 frames per second in 2.7K, because both of these modes give me a little bit of room in terms of the frame rate. With these additional frames, I can actually slow down the footage to around 40%, and that gives me a nice, smooth footage, looks much more stable, and also like this kind of dreamy lifestyle look I'm going for most of the time. Now, another reason to think about the frame rates is storage. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you're obviously using much less storage instead of using 60 or even more frames per second. And there are big cameras out there that shoot, for example, 4K in 1000 frames per second, and they fill up terabytes of data in no time at all. So for example, looking into the settings of an iPhone, into the frame rate settings and also the quality settings, it actually says that the 720p, so it's normal HD, in 30 frames per second is 60 megabytes per minute. If you're shooting full HD at 1080p with 30 frames per second, it is 130 megabytes per minute. And if you want to use the 60 frames per second with full HD, it's 175 megabytes per minute. But if you're shooting 4K, it's 350 megabytes per minute. But if you actually want to use the slow motion mode of the iPhone, which shoots 120 frames or 240, but then in just HD, then you would have to count on 350 megabytes for full HD at 120 frames per second and 300 megabytes for normal HD at 240 megabytes. And that's per minute. But in general, Having more frame rate with more resolution will of course mean more data used on your phone or on your camera. So if you're limited in space and just for the normal style shooting, you should probably stick to the 24 or 30 frames per second, which doesn't give you slow motion, but then you have more time to film. Again, I use the 60 frames per second for almost all my shots, but I also tend to just have small clips of things. So I film 20 seconds here, I film 10 seconds here. So that way I kind of keep my footage down and don't have those tons of data or minutes and minutes to go through. Now I hope this was helpful in understanding the frame rates a little more and knowing when to use which. Again, 24 frames per second is probably something you should use most of the time. If you know you want to do some slow motion stuff, then use the 60 or 120 depending on the camera settings you have to offer. And if I upgrade my camera at some point, I would probably use 120 frames per second for those smooth lifestyle-y shots and also being able to have the slow motion in there. Now, if this video was helpful for you, please give it a like, leave any questions in the comments down below, subscribe to this channel for more videos like this almost every day, and check out the playlist of videos that is linked in the description, where I have more of these videos about video making and photography, and I'm going to share a lot more in the coming weeks. Stay tuned and I will see you in the next video. Bye.